This presentation is basically organized in two parts. The first part is regarding the CPI, the City Prosperity Index, what we do at the global level. And the second part is actually very, very interesting, and it's actually, how can I say, like something really new, because I'm going to present to you results that we are actually having from this experience that we are currently calculating in Tomsk in Siberia. So first of all, who we are, I mean, in a very, very simple way, we are UN Habitat. We are the entity of the United Nations responsible to promote urban sustainable development. Let's say, for example, if we think about other United Nations entities, for example, UNESCO is related to culture, UNICEF is related to children, UN Habitat or mandate is related to cities, communities, and human settlements. Then, the second thing is actually what I'm going to be presenting today, the City Prosperity Index, the United Nations platform for urban data, developed to formulate evidence-based decision-making and monitoring for cities. And here we find the very first key element. Formulate evidence-based decision-making. That is our interest. Our interest is not data itself. Our interest is to place this data onto the public debate in order to increase the quality of public policies. This is an excellent, fantastic time to implement CPI in many cities. If we, for example, take into account the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, we know that in 2015, many countries, and all the countries of the United Nations system, they signed this agenda, the 2030 agenda, which is extremely ambitious and extremely interesting. One of the very interesting things when we implement the agenda at the local level is that it's always kind of difficult. It's always not really simple to localize the agenda. We really need like pins in order to understand how, let's say, the agenda works at the local level. For example, think about, we have 17 goals. Those goals are very, very different. They, for example, talk about children, hunger, cities. Of course, there are many. You have to follow a process in order to prioritize, for example, which objectives are more important for Moscow, since, of course, Moscow has its own peculiarities. So what I want to highlight is that CPI actually helps in this process of localizing the SDGs, and I will show you on the second part of this presentation. A very nice example. And the good news for us is the second point of this slide. We're very, very happy because we're actually calculating the CPI for Tomsk. We are working along the Tomsk State University. So in a very brief and quick way, two very basic ideas. One is the global scope of CPI. We currently have more than 530 cities covered. Why our interest? I mean, what we really like, what we really want is to have this, how can I say, this big picture of different conditions of cities. One very interesting thing that we have faced with this exercise is that it's very, very difficult to measure cities with the same, let's say, with the same scale. Why? Because, I mean, we understand things in a very, very different way there. And let's think, for example, about public space. I mean, it's very different, the connotation that we have in Europe, in America, about public space, and for example, in countries in the Arab region. Or let's say, for example, the basic services. I mean, it's very different, the kind of basic services we understand here in Russia, which includes, for example, heating systems, than, for example, in Southeast Asia. So it's been really a challenge to, let's say, develop this instrument in order to have, let's say, the common language. But so far we have this instrument, and it's quite with positive results. The other idea is this let's say, flexibility of CPI. How, with this the implementation of the index, we actually can tackle several things. For example, global monitoring, baseline setting, decision-making tool, policy dialogue, and monitoring instrument. And this is very, very important because we know, for example, I mean, even if local governments, of course, they serve to their citizenship, they also have, let's say, a global role. I mean, for example, Moscow. Of course, the mayor of Moscow is very, very committed towards citizenship and so on. But on the other hand, I mean, there is some kind of role at the international level of let's say, put on the table the advances of Moscow, let's say, regarding the implementation of the 2030 agenda. So in this slide, there are several keywords. And again, this is to emphasize that this very, very basic idea. It's not just the data just for the sake of data, because we want more numbers. Again, what we want is to improve the quality of life of citizens through improved data. And here, for example, we have several key words. And how, for example, this produced data relates and connects to other programs or other, let's say, interests of the device. For example, we have here the best practice program. We have here the head of the program of best practices in Nairobi. The CPI actually allows us, once we have, let's say, the computation for one city, we can compare with another city with similar characteristics. And through, let's say, this best practice database, we have more than 5,000 best practices on the system. So it's really, really easy, let's say, to look for a specific example of a good quality example that we could eventually replicate. And again, I mean, what we are trying to promote is not, let's say, the sharing of practices just on the surface. What we are actually promoting is the sharing of knowledge. That is actually the most important thing for us in the agency. So the other thing is very, very important is understanding factors which generate or inhibit prosperity and as a result have city profile briefing. I will show you a little example of that, and state of city report. So again, I mean, once we have data, what to do with all these numbers, and it's actually the interesting part of this process. So how CPI is shaped? We have basically 6 dimensions, and every dimension has specific numbers of sub-dimensions. And I want to highlight 2 very important ideas with this slide. One is the integrality of CPI. CPI also, I have to say, has inherited, let's say, the knowledge that the UN Habitat has, how can I say, gained regarding indicators. For example, in 1976 and 1996, I'm sorry, with the previous Habitat conferences, one of the outcomes was actually the responsibility for countries to start measuring things, for example, regarding housing, regarding slums, regarding, let's say, specific things that are important for cities. What happened in 2012 is that actually the UN Habitat designed this set of indicators, putting together all this knowledge from previous years and actually recognizing that urban, or let's say these urban conditions are very, very abroad. And we cannot talk only about housing, we cannot talk about only basic services if we, for example, do not understand public space, public mobility, urban productivity. Everything is interconnected in a very, very complex way, but finally interconnected. So what we are trying to do with CPI is actually recognizing this interaction of this intersectoriality, let's say, within a city. And the second thing I want to highlight is the importance for us of spatial data. What I mean with the spatial data is spatial indicators, and I will show you a very nice example of that. But the idea is that, let's say 80% of the indicators are basically statistical indicators, as we know, and the other percent, the other remaining is basically spatial indicators. So far, we have, as you saw in the other slide, we have relevant experience implementing CPI in many countries, and we have had several findings in general about the things that we can actually do and the things that are not really feasible. One of those is actually this very, very interesting thing, the correlation. I mean, how, for example, one aspect of urban prosperity relates to another. For example, what was really interesting in one exercise we did in Brazil, one of the sub-dimensions that had a lot of correlations was actually internet connection. So the principle, let's say for this specific city in Brazil, was that if they improve internet connection in all over the city, they were going to be able to, let's say, improve productivity capacities, quality in let's say, certain aspects of productivity. There are things that we, let's say, are kind of intuitive, but with CPI, this is actually one of the very positive things. For the first time in many countries, we have actually documented many of those things. And one, for example, another relevant example that is, let's say, for example, the importance of public spaces. This is mainly in Latin America. In Latin America, we were very, very surprised because it was very evident that those areas of the city without proper access to public space were the most, let's say, vulnerable, or let's say the most sensitive when talking about urban violence and, you know, this kind of delicate things. But again, I mean, for the first time, we had the documentation, we had the data there. So, another thing I want to highlight with this slide is this idea of the land, of the territorial information. It's not only, for example, economic burden, economic strength, but we're talking also about economic agglomeration. How urban density is so important in order to foster, in order to improve, let's say, some kind of productivity. And again, I mean, if we think, for example, the idea of clusters, of economic clusters, is basically there. It's basically an area of the city or several, let's say, a system of cities that are specialized in the production of certain things. So, this slide is a little bit more about the post-CPI. Once we have the numbers, what can we do with them? And this is actually really, really interesting because, again, I mean, it's not only about the number, it's about all the wide range of possibilities we have. And this is particularly interesting regarding participatory planning and participatory processes. Because you will see the reports, the CPI reports are very, very simple to read. It's a fantastic way to, let's say, socialize important matters of a certain city. And here the logic is very simple. I mean, in every urban and territorial planning process, we have, let's say, this chain of elements. We have first evidence, then we have the planning. We need, of course, evidence in order to produce planning. Then we have operationalization. What do we understand as operationalization? Let's say it's creating the conditions for, let's say, the blueprints to happen. So here let's say we produce blueprints, and here let's say we produce laws, and we produce financial schemes in order to, let's say, fulfill the plans. Then of course we have the implementation, and at the end we have the monitoring and evaluation, in which we are actually checking that the investments were actually productive. So this is actually really, really nice because with CPI we can tackle two parts of the chain, of this chain. But the very beginning, the evidence, of course, the planning, because again, I mean, it's a very, very nice way to show citizenship and governments where are the areas that need to be improved. And the very last part, because, for example, think about it, we want to build a new metro line. We, for example, here found the public mobility bar really low. Then here we have discussions. Here we decide how, let's say, build this new metro line. And here, for example, 5 years after the construction of that new metro line, we can actually see how, let's say, this investment affects all in a positive way, let's say, the other areas of prosperity. So there is a logic in all this, and again, I mean, the numbers, the evidence is, of course, a fundamental part of it. This is another thing that is usually very, very interesting, is, let's say, this global comparability. Again, I mean, when we put all the measured cities around the world together, how, let's say, this goes. I want to emphasize something really important for UN Habitat. For us, the priority is not to use this kind of rankings. For us, the message is very, very simple. I mean, the comparison we want to promote is when a city compares against itself. So let's say to promote the idea of self-improvement, not really like comparing with another cities. But in any case, there are many other really interesting things when we actually do this exercise of put all these cities together. This is, for example, we have here, for example, two things very, very clear. If we see, for example, the cities that usually rank with the highest rankings is Stockholm, Oslo, Copenhagen, Nordic cities, Scandinavian cities. And basically here, I mean, if we go for regions, we have Northern Europe, the Mediterranean Basin, Latin America, some cities in Asia here, and some cities in Sub-Saharan Africa here. This graph is really interesting because it allows us to understand what are the things that we are, how can I say, prioritizing in CPI. And one very interesting and remarkable idea is the idea of the public goods, the things that we have to share, that we actually put at the service of everyone within the city. What are public goods, for example? Again, public transportation, public space, even the system of governance, how let's say all the citizens relate to each other. And here is very, very clear that, I mean, it is no surprise why Scandinavian cities are on top of that. They have been very successful in doing so, and it is also very clear to see, I mean, the cities that need to improve that part. Another really interesting thing regarding this graph is that with experience, we have noticed, let's say, two things. One, and this is more at the national level. One, when the GDP of a country is higher, the availability of data is higher. When the GDP of the country is lower, the availability of data is actually lower. So, and this is a very, very good example. We have countries in general with very, very high GDP with a lot of data available. Countries with low GDP, we have a lot of challenges regarding data production. And data production is fundamental for us because data is actually like the source of all these exercises. So, I was saying in the beginning that we are very, very excited with these exercises for first city in Russia. Again, I mean, every city in each region is very different and presents very, very peculiar challenges. And we were actually very curious about the first findings of Tomsk. At the end of this exercise, let's say at the end of March, more or less, we will finish this Tomsk report. It's a very, very simple layout. Again, I mean, it's very, very interesting because it's really easy to share with people and very easy to understand. So what have we done so far in Tomsk? The first part of the process was, let's say, this data assessment. Check if all the data that is needed is available. We had a very, very positive result here. Here you have, for example, all the 62 indicators of the CPI. I showed you the slide with the dimensions and the sub-dimensions. Here we have the dimensions, and here in this other column we have the sub-dimensions, and here we have the 62 indicators. Yes. So in each indicator has this green, yellow, red light indicating their own their availability. And happily, let's say almost 80% of the indicators have green color. Let's say around the 15% of the indicators have a yellow color, and only 3 indicators actually have the red color. And these indicators, the red ones, is very peculiar because again, it's not that there are no technical capacities to produce a specific kind of data. It's usually related more to, let's say, more like outdated approaches or things like that. What we found here in Russia is, first of all, the necessity to have more information regarding densities. Let's say, at a smaller scale. I will show you later why that is so important. Another very interesting thing is that almost 80% of the information needed is coming from Rostad at the federal level. 15%, 18% is coming from the local government, and a small percentage is coming actually from inhabited, from this calculation we did for the spatial indicators. This is actually really nice. It's a really nice exercise. You just think about it's like a parachute. We're on a plane and then suddenly we just fell down and start seeing the city. The first challenge of the CPI is actually defining what are we going to measure. I mean the city limits. Let's say in some sense the definition of city. Here we have let's say the satellite image of not only Tomsk. There are several towns and rayons. Sorry for my terrible pronunciation. Basically, you have here Tomsk. This white line is Tomsk district, urban district. And here you have Seversk, and here you have another minor districts. If we see only, let's say, if we put this lens, and we want to see only the territory of the district, we have here Tomsk district. We have that most, basically 60% of the territory of the district is urban, and the other 40% is let's say natural coverage. If we go back, let's say, to this the exercise of the first image, but we, let's say, put all the green in black and white, and we make this difference between what is Tomsk and what is outside Tomsk regarding the urban fabric. We have Tomsk in red and the other towns in yellow. We have again Seversk, which has a considerable size in population in orange. This is another interesting exercise regarding the importance of the river. Is a city that actually was founded because of its location on the Tong River. So the river has a very, very important, a big importance on the city. It's a city, let's say, that developed mostly on only one side of the river. Here it's more or less clear to understand why. This is very, very, the level is very, very low, so it was really easy to have floodings and problems related to that kind of situation. So, what we are doing with the CPI regarding the spatial indicators, I'm just talking about the spatial indicators that we are actually currently measuring. That is actually really important, and as I mentioned, it's one of the very important added values of the index. So basically, we identify, let's say, the urban footprint of the city. we assigned, let's say, this kind of hexagonal grid to the city. Each hexagon measures one square kilometer, right? So at the end we have this, let's say, set of hexagons together that, let's say, are an abstraction of the city for one portrait. And here again, I mean, when you start comparing, it's really, really interesting. Here you have on the left the image for Tomsk, and on your right you have Mexico City. Of course, you're talking about 500,000 inhabitants, and here you're talking about 20 million inhabitants. But we can also understand things regarding densities. Again, I mean, we see how, for example, maybe density in Tomsk is lower than Mexico City. And when we start actually putting values on every specific hexagon, is when we start actually producing these temperature maps. And temperature maps are so important. They are inputs. They are actually giving us information about how, let's say, the city is working. Let's say it's not a good or bad note. It's just an objective note. It is describing something that is happening on the territory. You see, for example, this indicator is street intersection density. It means that we are counting the number of street intersections we have per hexagon. So, if you can see here, every black point is an intersection. And if we put this, let's say, on top of that, and we again assign color, hexagons on green are actually those that present the high numbers of intersection. And here is very, very clear. You have here a lot of streets, and here you have, of course, a lot of green hexagons. And again, I mean, what is the kind of analysis we can do on that? And I really want to take advantage my position as a foreigner, that I don't know the city, but I can start reading some things. First of all, I could assume that the historic city was developed here. Why? Because we know that the historic cities, I mean, they had this tendency to have smaller, narrower streets. And let's say the 20th century city was developed mostly on the south and towards the east. And that is actually true. That is something that actually happened in the past. And again, I mean, the very important message of this indicator is that it relates to the idea of accessibility and connectivity. How, let's say, this pattern facilitates citizens to have access to services and let's say opportunities. And if you, let's say, put another words, in this case, for example, human rights, it's actually a matter of human rights. I mean, because of course, when you think, for example, housing, labor, health, education, they are all four basic human rights, socioeconomic human rights. And of course, again, the pattern of the city matters a lot in order to understand how people are actually having access to these elements. Here we have another indicator. It's street length. It's literally the same exercise. For example, we draw all the streets here in this small map of Tomsk, and we put, let's say, all the grid on top of these hexagons. And again, I mean, the green hexagons are those that present, let's say, the hexagon with a proper allocation of street length. And again, this connects a lot with the idea of connectivity and accessibility. The very important or interesting things of this kind of exercise is when you overlap those maps to, for example, let's say, sports facilities. We are in a university town, and of course, the university population is very, very important. So let's say we overlap a sport facility map, and we start understanding where, let's say, it's more strategical to place, let's say, this kind of social infrastructures. Another extremely important element of the CPI, as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, is its linkage to the SDGs. And how, for example, several of the indicators are actually the same than the SDGs, and how, let's say, the other allows to understand better the SDGs indicators. We know that we have one goal, specific goal, related to cities, goal 11, make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And with this exercise, we actually calculated 2 indicators of the SDG. I don't know if it's the first time in Russia, but we are so far very, very proud of it. Because we're creating this kind of technical references. So we're talking about target 11.7, which says, by 2030, provide universal access to safe, inclusive, and accessible green and public spaces, in particular for women and children, older persons, and persons with disabilities. How are we going to measure this? We have a specific indicator that says average share of the built-up area of cities that is open space for public use for all, by sex, age, persons with disabilities. Okay? So basically, we use all this cartographic information we have about Tomsk, and through this exercise of photo detection, we actually identify the green areas. We're only talking about green areas so far. We still need to work on that, but so far we have green areas. And what the logic of the indicator is, let's say, create this kind of buffers of the green areas. Let's say here we have the green areas, and then the yellow color means, let's say, the buffer, how accessible those areas are for people living in the surroundings. So basically, what we can read here is, let's say, that the yellow areas are properly covered, or let's say the access to that green spaces is easy. And let's say that the gray areas is where this, let's say, condition needs to be improved at some point. Here we have a zoom in. I think it's a little bit clearer. So we basically have all this, as I said before, we have here these gray areas. It's quite evident. A very interesting learning regarding CPI is that CPI is mainly focused on quantitative data, which is important, but we also recognize that it's very, very important, on the other hand, to have qualitative data. Because sometimes, let's say, the quantitative indicator could say or could mention that, for example, in this case, the provision of green areas is positive. I mean, if we see a little bit more the map, the cities cover at least by 70% I mean, the accessibility to green areas is mostly like 70%. But when we talk about the quality of those areas, we have a very, very different narrative. So what we did in Tomsk is that actually for some strategic indicators, we actually conduct a very, very small survey in order to, let's say, check if the perception, let's say, was on the same page that regarding the hard data. So basically, regarding public space, we put this, we identified three questions, and the answers were extremely interesting. The first question is, there are enough public spaces in Tomsk. They are optimally distributed through the city. And we see that most of the answers actually express that they agree with this statement. And it's no surprise, because if we see the map, I mean, public spaces are well allocated in the city. The interesting things is when we pass to question number 2 and question number 3. Question number 2 is Tomsk public spaces are available to all. When we start talking about accessibility, again, not only about male, but also including women, including children, including elderly. And this actually was a little bit more interesting because we see that almost a quarter of the answers, they actually said, I strongly disagree with that. So, and if we think about, again, the target, by 2030, provide universal access to safe, inclusive, and accessible green in public spaces, in particular for women and children, older persons, and persons with disabilities. So something is happening here with the perception of that matter that we are measuring. And last, Tomsk public spaces have a high quality and attractive design. Here's a very, very qualitative question, and almost 50% responded, I disagree. So again, I mean, we see these situations in which the city, when talking about quantitative factors, they write, I mean, let's say high or medium high, but when we start seeing, let's say, other aspects, more qualitative aspects, there are several interesting things. The other example regarding the SDGs is also really interesting. Is regarding public transportation. The target says, by 2030, provide access to safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport systems for all, improving road safety, notably by expanding public transport, with special attention to the needs of those in vulnerable situations, women, children, persons with disabilities, and older persons. Proportion of population that has convenient access to public transport by sex, age, persons with disabilities. And basically it's the same principle. We identify all the stops of the public transport system in Tomsk, and then we draw a buffer. The buffer is 250 meters. And we can see here a really, how can I say, extended system of public transport, which at the first sight might seem possible. Here is a zoom in. But again, when we put this, let's say, qualitative layer in the research, many interesting things came up. First question, public transport has improved in Tomsk over the last 5 years. Almost a third responded, I strongly disagree. Tomsk public transport is accessible, safe, affordable, and sustainable. Just the four same terms that we are using on the target. And almost half of the answers were I strongly disagree. So again, I mean, maybe we're talking a very positive, adequate coverage, but when we start talking about affordability, sustainability, accessibility, and safety, is when actually we find this kind of interesting thing. This is extremely interesting. Again, when you overlap the results of this question with the map. And last but not least, this is also really interesting. The last 5 years, the bicycle infrastructure has been improved in Tomsk. We're talking about a university town. I know I'm very, very aware that the weather conditions are harsh in Siberia, but what we usually see in other cases is that usually this kind of university towns that they provide, let's say, possibilities. I mean, they're not only providing one kind of urban mobility. They usually provide, let's say, even at a minimal level, several kinds of urban mobility. So the answer here was that more than a half answer I strongly disagree. So far, this is what we have for Tomsk. of course, I mean, we're still working a lot on the results. I mean, this was actually like the first computation we had. For example, many of the missing bars are still indicators that are still processing. Maybe the only exception is water and energy. Here we have indicators regarding recycling, and here is very, very obvious because the city still needs to work a lot on the recycling systems. But let's say more or less, the first glimpse, the first computation is this. So, I would like to share, this is the final slide, I just want to share the preliminary findings, what we have learned so far with this exercise. In both terms, data provision in Tomsk is satisfactory, yet important data gaps have been identified in the following areas. So the densities, as I mentioned before, public mobility, we do not, for example, we do not have the information regarding, for example, the users disaggregated by gender, disaggregated by people with disabilities and age. And this is, I will be very, very sure that this is also the same case for Moscow. Even big cities, even if there is the technical capacities to collect this data, to produce this data, we're still a little bit behind. And again, it's not a matter of resources, it's, let's say, more like a matter of updating, let's say, criteria of how we gather information. And last is overcrowding conditions. We don't know this kind of information. Second, further assessments on the qualitative provision of urban services is recommended, especially public space, public transport, or CPI. And last but not least, CPI results should be integrated into existing urban monitoring platforms. So, gracias.